Welcome to the Sourcegraph Codebase and Repository Tour. If you're just joining us at Sourcegraph, let me start by saying welcome. We're super excited to have you join us. I hope you'll find this an informative video that'll give you an overview of what our codebase looks like and how it's organized, and in general, give you an introduction to how our repositories are structured. My name is Marek. I'm an engineer and lead of engineering education at Sourcegraph. So you may see a few of my videos during your onboarding. So let's jump into it. Let's jump into a tour of our codebase and of our repository structure. Let's take a look. The starting point is the Sourcegraph organization on GitHub. This is where we have all of our repositories, and this is where you basically have access to everything that has to do with our code base. Now you'll see that we have multiple repositories, but let's start by talking about the largest and main repository that we use. It is the repository called Sourcegraph. So it's located here at sourcegraph/sourcegraph. This is the repository that contains the entire product. So what you see if you go on sourcegraph.com, or what you see if you are using, like one of our customers, if you're using a self-hosted instance of Sourcegraph, it's running the code in this repository. So this is what we might call a mono repo, in that it contains a lot of different services, all the different parts of the product in one repository. It contains really multiple packages, but instead of these packages being spread out, they're contained in one place. There are also other repositories that we have that do contain some other packages, other parts that are not in the main repository, but the majority of the code is actually right in this one repository. In this repository on GitHub, we also have most issues and pull requests that have to do with the code. Under issues, you'll find that there are many issues here, and that's because many of these do have to do directly with work that's happening that concerns the code itself. We also use issues for tracking all kinds of work, so that's why we do have a lot of issues in here. We really use GitHub issues extensively for project management, just in general. And we also use pull requests, obviously, for doing work on the code. Pull requests always go through a code review cycle, and we do have automated checks that each pull request has to go through. So before I jump into what's in our main repository, the actual file structure, I'll mention some other repositories that you may find as you're looking through the list of repositories. And here are some that you may want to pay attention to. First of all, the handbook repository. This repository contains all of the content of the handbook. It also contains the actual code that runs the handbook. So whether you're editing the content, whether you're adding pages, adding yourself to our team page, that may be your first interaction with this repository, you'll find it all here. We encourage you, and we encourage everyone, to make updates to the handbook. If you're browsing the handbook and you see things that could be corrected or that need to be updated, or if you want to add something to clarify something that's already there, go ahead, just create a pull request and make those edits. That's what the repository is for. The About repository, that's the About site. So that's the marketing website, the blog, and other content that is not part of the main web app. That's in the About repository. Some other projects that have their own repositories include Zookt, the trigram search indexing library that we use. CodeIntel extensions, that's a big important part of how code intelligence works in Sourcegraph. Source CLI, well, that's our main CLI tool that you can use to interact with Sourcegraph. It has its own repository. Sourcegraph extensions each have their own repository typically. So Sourcegraph extensions, they're distinct from the Sourcegraph browser extensions, by the way. These are extensions that use the Sourcegraph extensions API to extend its functionality. You can find those with the repo type extension label. There's quite a few of those. And if you're doing work on the front end, then you may notice the ESLint config repository that contains our ESLint configuration. This is basically the convention that we use in all repositories that use ESLint. And Prettier RC is similarly a config file for code formatting that we use on the front end across different repositories. So I want to spend a few minutes now talking about the contents of the main Sourcegraph repository. So we'll take a look at how files are structured and how different areas of the product are in this one repository. We use buildkite as our CI/CD pipeline, and in the .buildkite directory, you'll find some files related to that there. .github is where GitHub Actions and also issue and pull request templates are located. Actions are typically under the workflows directory, and you'll see we have quite a few of these that we use for doing checks or automated steps in our pull requests, for example. The .VS Code directory contains some default settings for VS Code. If that's the editor that you use, it'll be automatically loaded if you open the project in VS Code. And that includes a few VS Code extensions that we use, or really a list of recommended extensions that work well with the tooling that we're already using in the project. Client is the directory that contains the really the web front end parts of Sourcegraph. So this includes the web application itself, but it also includes other parts such as the browser extensions, Storybook, which is a tool for developing front-end components, React components. The wildcard component library is here, and a few other things such as ESLint plugins and parts that are related to the extensions API. CMD contains services written in Go. These are typically the servers that actually perform work, and they are running as part of the collection of services that are running when Sourcegraph is hosted somewhere. Dev contains a bunch of scripts and tools and services, mostly having to do with developing Sourcegraph. So you'll find a lot of random stuff in here that helps with development, utilities, scripts, and some configuration files that are relevant to local, running Sourcegraph locally for development. Doc is the documentation site. So the entire docs of Sourcegraph live in this directory, and it's actually rendered as a website using a tool called a doc site. This is a Go tool, which has been developed internally in-house at Sourcegraph, so it's our own website tool, and it's used to power the entire documentation site, which is in here. In Docker images, we have some files related to Docker. So these are derived Docker images that we use that are preferred for running Sourcegraph, or derivative rather, not derived. Enterprise is a special directory. This is actually the directory that contains parts of the code base that are not open source. So whatever is in the enterprise directory, or whatever is in any directory that has enterprise in its path, these are areas of the code that are not open source, but instead are licensed under our enterprise license instead. Internal and lib, these are two directories that contain Go files that are part of a variety of services, or are packages used by services that run as part of the Sourcegraph backend. Migrations are related to database migrations. So migrations are used whenever we are upgrading or downgrading a deployment of Sourcegraph. The changes to the database are all contained in what we call migrations. Monitoring. This is related to tools for monitoring a running Sourcegraph deployment, but specifically here we have monitoring generators that generate some of the configuration or the code that needs to exist for monitoring to work. The schema directory has a lot of data schemas. These are schemas that define the formats that we use for some things like configuration, but also a number of other formats that we use. So there's a lot of JSON schema files in here, as well as some Go utilities that manipulate or generate things based on these schemas. And finally, UI/assets. Well, it basically contains a number of assets that are used in the UI. So mostly that's images that we use in the interface. Sourcegraph is mostly open source. It's open core. So the core of the product is open source. How does that translate into the actual code that you see here? Well, the main Sourcegraph repository is actually dual licensed. So the majority of the code in the repository is open source. It's released under a permissive open source license, the Apache 2 license. But it's dual licensed because some of the code is enterprise code that is released not under an open source license. It's an enterprise license. So any code that is in the enterprise directory and anything that's actually mentioned in the README as being excluded from the open source license, that code is not open source. But the entire repository is public. So that's a distinction here. Even though the entire repository is public, which means that anyone can view it, that doesn't mean that the entire repository is licensed under an open source license. So that's a distinction to keep in mind. I'll mention a few of the files in the top level here. You'll see that there's quite a few dot files here. There are some editor configuration files and ESLint. There are some Git files such as git ignore and git attributes. NVM-RC is relevant to running Node.js. It contains the Node version that we use. There are some more ignore and configuration files here, style-lint and prettier, namely. And some useful markdown files that you may want to be aware of include the changelog. That is where we list all changes for each version of Sourcegraph. Contributing, license, README, and security. Those are also important top-level files that give an overview of each of those things. Contributing is aimed at external contributors. The README file is obviously a good starting point for getting started developing. There are several JavaScript configuration files, namely for Gulp, Jest. Lighthouse is a performance tool that we use. Renovate is a tool that we use to keep our dependencies up to date. It's actually a GitHub bot that opens pull requests to provide updates. And finally, because we use TypeScript on the front end, you'll find a tsconfig file, and since we use yarn for packages as well, a yarn lock file is the last file in the directory. And that concludes our tour of the Codebase and repositories. So I hope that gives you a general high-level overview of what our repositories contain and where things are in the Codebase. I invite you to dig deeper and take a closer look at some of the directories we have to get familiar with the backend services that we have that are mostly written in Go, but also to go into our front end, our client directory, and take a look at the components that make up our front end as well. There's lots to explore there.